What's going on, guys? I hope you're doing well. Just for a little bit of context, as some of you may know, I've been doing a lot of freelance work lately. Unfortunately, most of the characters I work on are under NDAs, which means I'm unfortunately not allowed to share them with you. However, one of the companies I worked with ended up cancelling a project that involved the 3D character creation of this wolf character, and were even kind enough to let me show it off on the Nikki channel, so without further ado, enjoy this quick video I put together for you. After the client sent me a small presentation giving me an idea about what they wanted the character to look like and what personality he should have, I could get cracking. The first thing I did was to have a look around on BlendSwap to see if there were any templates or assets I could use, but unfortunately there wasn't really anything that useful. I did, however, find this awesome Labrador head mesh and decided to use it as a starting point. So usually I would go ahead and sculpt the head myself, and then I would, retopologize it. But this time I thought I would try something a little bit different. I also found these awesome reference images I could work with. So I started by deforming the Labrador mesh to align with the wolf reference, as, Labradors and wolves have very different anatomy. Originally, I went with this more cartoony style, but then I figured it looked a bit too goofy, so I went with slightly more realistic proportions. After a lot of squashing and stretching, I ended up with this somewhat acceptable looking mesh. Then I could model a very basic body, making sure I stick to the reference. As the character evolves, the anatomy and proportions will of course change, but this is very helpful to at least, get the basic proportions right from the start. I could then do the same thing with the arms and legs. The tail is a bit different. The nice fluffy shape of the tail will be achieved later on with fur grooming. The base mesh should actually be very thin, but we'll get back to that in just a second. Now, for the hands and feet, I pretty much just ripped them right off an awesome Judy Hopps model available on BlendSwap. After rescaling them and making sure the mesh blends in with the arms and legs, it was time to retopologize. Now, for those of you who are interested, I explained in a bit more detail what retopology is in my Blitzo timelapse video I made a while back. Although this step is quite long and tedious, it's actually quite satisfying and therapeutic for some reason. Because the hands and feet were a separate mesh, I merged their vertices with the retopo mesh to end up with a single smooth mesh. And of course at this point it looked more like a mutated rat man thing, but in the early stages they always do. Now, I didn't like the ears, so I deleted the vertices and just re-extruded them from scratch. Then I added in 2 spheres as the eyeballs, and then just tweaked around some more with the mesh, this time moving away from the reference and actually modeling it more to my liking. At this point, I sent the client a few screen grabs of the model, and they felt like the head still looked a bit too cartoony, so I, again, made the proportions even more lifelike. And of course, at this point, it's still an unrendered and unlit, pre-visualization of what the character might look like. The graphics are still hideous. But if you are just dying to see some really sweet graphics and 3D renders, perhaps I could interest you in World of Warships, the sponsor of today's video. World of Warships is a free interactive PC game with some pretty rad looking graphics. You can pick between over 300 historically accurate ships and even customize them to your liking. Some of the landscapes are absolutely gorgeous, but if they are not gorgeous enough for you, you can go ahead and customize them to your liking as well. Depending on your playstyle, you can pick between 4 types of ships: destroyers, battleships, cruisers, and air carriers. So to play, check out the link in the video description. If you use the code BOOM, you get access to a huge starter pack. It contains 200 doubloons, 2 ships, St. Louis and a premium ship called Emden, 20 Restless fire camouflage, 2.5 million credits, and 7 days of premium. Again, thank you to World of Warships for sponsoring this video, and be sure to use the code BOOM for a great starter pack. Alright, let's get back to the video. Now for the clothing. And there are many ways to do this, but the quickest method is to simply select the vertices in the areas clothing would be present, separate them from the base mesh, and then slightly scale them up. I made sure the seam between the skin and the clothing mesh stayed hidden out of sight by simply pulling in a few vertices behind the clothing. Now, in general, there's actually no point in having a skin mesh below the clothing, as it would never be visible anyway, and even worse, it could actually result in clipping issues later on. Now, although the client knew that they wanted their character to wear clothes, they weren't entirely sure what, clothing style they wanted to go for. All they knew at this point is that they wanted the character to look, very masculine and alpha. So we quite literally searched alpha male in Google, and this is the first image that came up. So we decided to try giving the wolf a waistcoat. I quickly modeled a very basic mesh using the shirt as support and slightly scaled it up. After applying a few basic materials to the mesh, just to get an idea of what it will look like, I worked on the rigging. As always, I'll be using the awesome Rigify add-on. I also gave the model a really, rough and quick fur system to, again, get a quick preview, but don't worry, we'll be giving it a proper groomed fur system later in the video. After spending some time laying out the parent bones, Rigify will generate a really advanced rig with IK, FK controllers, etc. This add-on is actually super dope, and I use it for pretty much all my characters. Now, before I started adding, details in the clothing, etc., I had to send the client a few renders so that they could get a quick preview. However, at this point, this is what the rendered character looked like. Now, yeah, even though sending a render like this is pretty embarrassing, it's actually quite important so that the client can make sure I was going in the right direction. Also, we decided to drop the waistcoat idea as it kind of made him look more like a waiter. Next up, the facial expressions. Here I'm using shape keys to essentially reposition the vertices without losing the original mesh. At the end, I would usually end up with about maybe 20 shape keys, depending on how specific and subtle I want to get with the expressions. Then, by combining these shape keys and adjusting their intensity, I can pretty much end up with any facial expression imaginable. Of course, because the client wanted the character to be able to open his mouth, I had to give him a set of teeth. Now, instead of remodeling a set from scratch, I simply ripped a copy right off Tony's model and slightly tweaked the vertices so that they would accommodate for the different anatomy of this particular character. I also modeled a quick tongue. Even though the tongue won't be very visible at all, it actually makes a huge difference when the mouth is open. Now for the fun part, fur grooming. So for this particular character, I created a few separate fur systems. One for the head, one for the hands, one for the feet, one for the legs, and one for the tail. I also added a fur system at the back of the head to, to fluff things up a bit. I also tried adding a system at the top of the head to try and, give the character some kind of hairstyle, but we decided not to keep it. These canine characters tend to have longer hair in the cheek area, so I would usually create a separate system for that. And just to quickly explain how fur systems work, you basically have what's called the parent hairs and the children hairs. The parent hairs are the ones I can individually manipulate through different grooming tools, and the children hairs will essentially follow the parents. This particular character has just over 1 million individual strands of hair, and I'm sure you can imagine manipulating that many strands of hair individually isn't exactly convenient, which is why the parent-child system is so important. And I also added individual parent hairs for the whiskers. And as I was busy working on the character, one of the artists working with the client photoshopped this badass looking leather jacket on top of one of the renders and suggested giving the character glasses. So I pretty much gave the shirt a leather texture, extruded a collar and modeled some nice thick sleeves. Then I sculpted in the pockets and the silver button things. Then of course I sculpted in the folds and wrinkles. Now, although the folds looked okay, I wasn't really happy with the pockets as they looked a bit too, organic. You see, buttons and zips are solid mechanical parts, which is not very easy to achieve through sculpting. So I got rid of those and replaced them with separate modeled objects. This did make rigging a bit more complicated, but I got there eventually. Then I modeled a simple belt, again as a separate modeled object, as sculpting this directly on the jacket mesh would have just been a nightmare. Now, sculpting artists with some experience could probably pull this off no problem, but as you may know, pure sculpting is definitely not my forte. As for the glasses, I had already worked on a pair of glasses with another character that you might have seen in my demo reel. So I copy-pasted those glasses onto the wolf model, tweaked the vertices so that the glasses didn't look too out of place, and changed the glass material to make it fit with the wolf's color palette. And since this particular character was supposed to be the mascot for a crypto-based company, the client wanted the Bitcoin symbol to be represented somehow. So I simply modeled a nice silver chain necklace to represent that. Now I could work on the wolf's texture paint. I painted a thin dark line around the mouth and the eyes. Of course this is necessary as a real dog's face will have tons of color and texture variations. This also makes the facial expressions really pop and easy to read. I painted the claws brown and gave the nose a leather texture. Of course a real wolf's nose isn't made of leather, but this looks similar enough. The The last thing I worked on was the eyebrows, and of course you can't really give a character human expressions without them, as eyebrows are one of the key elements that define a basic human expressions, and I used yet another fur system for this. Now, eyebrows are really tricky, as if they are too thin, it tends to make the character look more, feminine, and if they are too thick, it can be quite distracting and, not very realistic. And after some final tweaking around, ladies and gentlemen, we have a lovely rigged wolf dude. Unfortunately, the client cancelled the project before I started posing or animating him, but for the sake of this video, I gave our wolf dude a few cool poses and added a quick lighting setup. So, here are a few renders. And that'll do it for this time. Again, a huge thank you to the client for letting me share the character with you fine people. If you want to see more of my work, you can check out my demo reel. It should be available on my channel somewhere. Also for my Ukrainian followers, I'm really f***ing sorry to hear what's happening. Sending you plenty of good vibes, and I hope this will all work out in the end. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.